All right. The next story comes also from Bleeping Computer. Yes, yet another trend on where Jerry spends his time. And the title is
It's
Hackers
also
Leak.
my fault. I send you a lot of these, and I don't know
No,
that.
it's it's all good. It's all good. They
I
have good
think
stuff. Look, they have
no,
good
they
stuff.
do. No, it's like just for behind the scenes. I have an RSS reader. I use Feedly, and I have probably 40 different InfoSec press stuff I go through. And I think Bleeping Computer just happens to be higher in my sort. And so I could find the same story in 6 different feeds, but I get to them first often. So, but they do a fine job. We like to find folks at Bleeping Computer.
They are a quality news outlet, and I'm sure somebody will tell me why that was a horrible thing for me to say, but I like them until I find a reason not to. So the title here is, if I can get back there, Hackers Leak Configs and VPN Credentials for 15,000 FortiGate devices. Fortinet just can't catch a break.
Just give up.
I made the comment on Mastodon a few days ago about how it's getting to be too risky to have a firewall in your network. And actually, it was in response to yet another Fortinet 0-day that was being actively exploited, which, by the way, is not what this article is about. So this article was
Right.
actually about a set of apparent 0 days that happened in the 2022 timeframe. It's a little unclear if they were 0 days at the time of the breach, but the threat actor here at the time had connected to and stolen configuration and credential information out of about 15,000 Fortinet devices. Now, the reason this is now news 3 years after it happened is that they just recently posted this information publicly. And so it's probably a little bit out of date, but I thought the more interesting thing to talk about was that it happened in the first place. This was very clearly a methodical. I mean, you don't connect to 15,000 devices by hand and root through them. There were very clearly some kind of a systematic attack to connect to, breach, and then pull back the information. And it was very neatly categorized by country and version and whatnot, including credentials to access the VPN through these devices. And so I thought it was a good talking point on making real some of the challenges, some of the vulnerabilities that have been beleaguering Fortinet devices. And look, it's not just Fortinet. It's been happening to Cisco's and Palo Alto's and other device manufacturers as well. Not trying to necessarily pick on Fortinet, although they do seem to be finding themselves in this spot quite a lot, and maybe even more than most other companies. But this is a real problem. Like when one of these vulnerabilities happens, it's not theoretical. Actors are going out there and at scale they're compromising and collecting your information, and you may not even realize that it's happened because it quite often happens before you're even aware that there was a vulnerability in the first place, let alone a patch for the vulnerability. And then you become aware and you patch the device, and what you don't know is that somebody's already downloaded all the information for it and they have ongoing access because they've stolen credentials out of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like typically what we see is when somebody gets some sort of initial access like this, there's a whole market out there to sell that information. So to dump it like this is not typical. Either they didn't feel it was worth it, or they wanted to do it to like get their name out there, which kind of is implied, but who knows? They're bad actors. You can't necessarily take everything they say at face value. But yeah, as far as I know, I don't think we picked up any chatter back then about a widespread O-Day on Fortinet that allowed this sort of data collection or widespread exploitation activity, follow-up exploitation activity. It makes you wonder, like, how often these are sitting. How often is this sitting out there in the world that we don't know about for other vendors and other tools? And yeah, I don't know. But to your point, it's aged a bit, but I would wager at least half of these creds probably have never changed.
Right.
Yeah.
As I was thinking about it, these devices are the thing that separates or protects our our networks. And they quite often is in this instance are the means by which we connect into our network through a VPN. And in this instance, some of the information that was stolen were the credentials to log in. Now, I don't know exactly if they were hard coded in the Fortinet device or if they were able to pull them out of memory and they were using Active Directory authentication or Radius or what have you. That part is not at all clear to me. But to me, it portends perhaps a different response when we find out that there was a 0 day that was under active exploitation that could result in a certain class of incident on our firewalls, that perhaps we have to take a more methodical response when those happen, which would, perhaps include like rebuilding the device or, reflashing it and rotating any credentials and so on. Because in this instance, we don't learn until 2 years later. Now, presumably, if somebody was going to attack you using the information that was stolen, you've probably already suffered the breach. What we don't know is how often that happens, because a lot of, unless like you're a GoDaddy or an hotelier, your story isn't made public. But I think there's a lot, probably hundreds of times more breaches that never see the light of day in the media that we don't hear about.
Yeah, which is an interesting problem we've talked about from time to time of if your security program is just chasing what the media is reporting as the latest shiny to go secure, you're probably missing a lot of stuff. And
Right.
we're all guilty of it. Hell, this show is somewhat based on this concept of talking about things that are in the media and taking the lessons learned from it. But
Right.
there's probably a very small percentage of actual threat actions that make any sort of widespread media coverage.
But I think it's a representative sample. Even though it's not necessarily comprehensive, it gives you an idea of the kinds of things that are going on out there. And look, the other thing that I gave a talk in Raleigh a couple of weeks ago now, and one of the takeaways that I had hoped to impress on people was that, you know while we talk about, these attacks and exploits and vulnerabilities here, this isn't comprehensive. Like, we spend an hour or take a week talking about a certain small set of things. I think the more important takeaway is there's a lot of the stuff that that's out there and happens. And I I, I want not only to have, a discussion about what happened and what can we learn, but also my hope is that people take away the reality that this stuff is out there for you to go read about and think about. You don't have to necessarily wait for people to talk about it on a podcast to learn about it,
Yeah.
and kind of learn, figure out what your lessons are. I sincerely want people to learn that there is a hot pan on the stove and not touch the hot pan. And if, just because Jerry and Andy don't talk about the hot pan on the stove, it's still there, and you can learn that it happened. And
Yeah,
look,
your stoves and your pans may be very different than ours, too.
exactly, exactly. Maybe it's not a cast iron pan. Maybe it's a, fancy Cuisinart pan, or I don't know if those are even fancy. Whatever.
Yeah, it's, the other takeaway I look at from this kind of story is have in the back of your mind the concept of your key perimeter control failing. What sort of next level detection would be useful in that case? If you had a bad actor get in, how else could you notify that? How would you? They have typical patterns. If you look at like MITRE's, one of many examples of like a framework of a typical attack chain. So, one, if you have the cycles and the skill set, one interesting activity is, all right, let's assume that a bad actor has silently and fully compromised my perimeter and now is inside of my so-called, crunchy exterior shell. What would they do and how might I detect them? And then work to build that sort of thing out. So it's not that we just want to just assume that all of our controls suck. But this goes back to the old concept of defense in depth. If right now we're dealing with an epidemic of perimeter firewalls having problems, this is somewhat cyclical. Like, we have these trends that go different areas at different times. Right now, firewalls are taking their turn in the barrel for whatever reason. I don't know all the confluence of events have brought us to this massive confluence. Again, I'll use that word of problems being found in firewalls. Maybe it's just sort of like leading others. One person finds it and other people start auditing those areas, or I don't know. I don't know what the correlating trend is, but nonetheless, it's a good example of don't put all your trust in that particular control. How do I back it up with other detection or preventative controls? Which is a long way to say defense in depth.
Yeah, I don't know how much longer to expect we're going to see these firewalls just being hammered, but I don't see any evidence of it slowing down. And it certainly seems like the these class of enterprise firewalls have enough vulnerabilities in them to keep it going for a while.
Well, I would like to think that the manufacturers are spending more of their attention shoring up and finding these problems because of this widespread
Yeah.
exploitation. But maybe that's naive.
Well, yeah. I mean, we don't know. We don't know what goes on behind the scenes. Like we there could have been 1,000, and they're fixing 100 of them a month, and it's just a foot race.
I'm
We
pretty
just
sure it's like the dancing scene in Quest for the Holy Grail and Camelot, where they're all just dancing on the round table. That's what I think is happening.
got
That's part of the
yes.
agile process, isn't it?
I think it is. Yeah,
The deployment dance.
right. Yeah, we
Yeah.
call that a scrum, I think.
Oh my. We'll just
All
cut
right.
this out. I don't think this needs to make the
I agree.